Hey guys, Grand J here and I am back. And in today's video we are asking, does this look like the face of mercy? So, do you like having fun? Do you like value? And do you like opening loot boxes without having to pay for them? Well then, Agrius is the card for you. Being a 6 CP 7k forward, this lovely lady is certainly below the curve. But how is this card value? Well, when Agrius enters the field, reveal cards from the top of your deck until you reveal a character of cost 3 or less. If you can play it, then play it. So you're paying 6 CP for a 7k body and to randomly play a free CP card. Considering you're getting the card and playing it, the effect can be worth up to 5 CP worth of value. Pretty good considering it only costs 6 CP to play her. But what if you can't play the card? Then unfortunately this card effect fails and you get nothing. So how do we guarantee that we'll always get this effect? Easy, only play one copy of each card of free CP or less. So we can prevent failing the effect, but one-offs make a deck pretty inconsistent, right? Well, what if we take this further and make all our low-cost cards free CP backups? See what I'm getting at here? Free CP backups are some of the most cost-effective backups in the game. And getting one for free every time you play Agrius sounds pretty good, yeah? Now imagine you start the game with 6 cards in hand. You pitch 3 cards to play Agrius, flip over say an Ico, then get a card from Ico's effect. Now you've got 3 cards in hand and have 7k forward and a backup in play. You've just effectively paid 2 CP to put a backup and a forward into play. So that's pretty good value there. But we're not done just yet. How do I take this one step further and make this deck actually broken? Well, let me introduce you to Agrius' new best friend, Rinoa. Now when Rinoa comes to play, it allows you to remove one of your forwards and immediately play it again, effectively allowing you to copy her enter play ability. So remember how we said Agrius' ability was worth 5 CP? Which was pretty good value considering I only paid 6 CP for her. Now imagine if we only have to pay 4 CP for her. That's what Rinoa does, exactly. Now imagine this scenario. You're going first, you have 6 cards in hand, you pitch 3 of them and play Agrius. You play a free CP backup like Mog 13 or Ico and get a free card from him, which leaves you with 3 cards in hand. Now, how about we pitch another 2 cards from hand to play Rinoa, copy Agrius' ability, play another free CP backup for free, maybe a Gestalian Empire Sid and get a free Celis or something. So where does that leave us? Alright, ending the first turn of the game with 2 backups, 2 7k forwards and a single card in hand. Like I said, does this look like the face of mercy to you? So with introductions out the way, here's the full deck list. I have it in list form and image form for you guys. There's also a link in the description for FFTCG where you can save and favorite the deck for future reference as well. Now that I've pitched the basic premise of this deck to you, let's take it from there. This deck only has 5 characters that are free CP or lower, and there are targets for Agrius. Mog 13, Gestalian Empire Sid, and Ico are your standard free CP search backups. Then to give our forwards just a little bit more punch, we've got 1 copy of Jukelarg and Ophelia. Mog 13 will get you Orphan, Banana Sid will get you Celis or Setzer, and Ico can get you either Steiner or Kuja. Since most of our forwards are ice, Jukelarg makes sense, and our 2 main water forwards are knights, so bumping Agrius up to 8k or Steiner up to a base 7k is pretty good. Not to mention both of these knights actually get even bigger with their own effects. Now since our strategy is so heavily based upon Agrius and Rinoa, it makes sense to play triple Merwhip and double Ysayle. Both of these backups will search for a forward of their respective elements. And to round up our backup line, we've got 2 copies of Devout, which are great plays after you've got a pair of backups already set up. Plus they combo very nicely with Rinoa as well as a whole lot of the other forwards. And that's all. Yeah, just 12 backups. And this is a endgame ramp deck with only 12 backups by the way. But trust me on this one though, you don't need that many backups with Agrius. So that's a lot of search so far, but even at effectively 6 copies of Agrius in our deck, those odds still just aren't good enough for me. So we chucked in 3 copies of Legendary Poem, which lets you look at the top 3 cards of your deck and add one of them into your hand. Which doesn't dig that deep, but pretty much guarantees you have Agrius ready by a second turn at the latest. As for the rest of your forwards, they're kind of just filler. We have the FF9 characters that are our search targets for Ico. Steiner 5 will be our usual forward that you'll search for with Ico. Kuja is in case you ever need to search for an ice card with Ico or Steiner, though he can be used in the later game as a last resort in case you need to clear out a specific ice backup like Ysayle. And 1 copy of Legendary Steiner is in there as a later game play once you've accumulated a bit of damage. The FF6 forwards are Setzer and Celis. If you have free backup setup, then Setzer is your usual selection, but Celis is usually better if you haven't got to that stage of the game just yet. Also, Celis at free gives you the potential to cast Runic to stop major spells such as Diabolos or Exodus. Next, Orphan is in the deck at free as a major ice finisher and the only target for Mog 13. Having free might seem overkill, but it does allow you to discard it early on and still have multiple left in deck as a late game win condition. We have 3 copies of the legendary Sephiroth to help us extend our advantage in the mid game. Because our deck is able to set up backups faster than our opponent, we can efficiently play this card and discard cards from our opponent's hand. 1 copy of the 5 CP version is there to be discarded for Shadow Flare, but can also be used in the earlier turns as our hand size is pretty small during the mid game. Finally, to round out the forwards, we have 2 copies of the quintessential Genesis. Not much explanation needed for this card really, as he's really just that strong a card. He's there to help our 7k forwards attack through, and he's also another threat the opponent has to deal with. The summons we include in this deck are pretty flexible and will be mainly used as a way to support our forwards. This is a pretty forward orientated deck, so we won't be relying too much on using our summons in proactive plays. A lot of their uses will be very specific, so I'll go into more depth on their uses in the matchup section of the video. Now onto the stats of the deck. In terms of power, I would rate this deck about a 7.5 or 8 out of 10. It's definitely a much stronger deck than most decks you will see at your locals, but it doesn't have quite the overwhelming finisher or control pieces that current S tier decks have. Regarding consistency, it's really consistent a lot of the time. In a few times where you don't get one of the many openings that you like, you'll find yourself struggling, but most of the time you'll have a pretty good start. Then with all the searches that you have in the deck, you'll be able to easily link one play into another. In terms of speed, I consider this a tempo deck. It starts off really fast and forces your opponent to have to match your deck's aggression and speed, but the deck also ramps up fast and has plenty of strong expensive finishes as well, allowing you to win the game before your opponent really has the time to fully set up. Now onto the worst part of this deck, the price. This is not a cheap deck to build. It doesn't have super expensive cards like Wall, Diabolos, Shantotto, or Maria, but this deck it literally runs 22 legendaries. So unless you have a lot of these cards lying around already, it's not something you can just easily chuck together, unfortunately. As for the most important factor of this deck, how fun is it? Honestly, it is a super fun deck to play. Every time you play Agrius, it's just so fun to flip over cards from your deck and see what surprise you get. Then later on in the game, you just get to drop big dude after big dude. This is an absolute blast of a deck to play. Regarding actually playing the deck, our mulligan strategy is pretty simple. Do you have either Whip or Agrius? If you do, then keep it. If you don't, then mulligan. 100% that simple. As for your early gameplay, if you have Agrius, play her straight away. If you don't have Agrius but have Whip, then play that straight away, search your Agrius and play it. If you have neither of those, then play Porom. It's statistically very likely that you'll have at least one of these 9 cards in the top 11 cards of your deck, which is how many cards you would have seen on your first turn had you mulliganed. So if you play Porom, there's a very high chance of revealing Agrius or Whip. If you don't have an Agrius or Whip, then you can also choose to play a Renoa, choosing your Porom so you can use the reveal ability again. If you don't have any of the above, then do not do anything that will shuffle your deck. Do not play a searching backup or a searching forward. The chances of getting Agrius or a searcher in the next 2 turns are really high at this stage. There's about a 65% chance that you'll draw Agrius over the next 2 turns. This chance also gets significantly higher if you fail to find one using Porom, as Porom doesn't shuffle your deck, but puts the other cards to the bottom of your deck, allowing you to cycle even closer to your Agrius or Whip. If you still don't have any other plays you can make, then feel free to play a non-searching backup or a forward. And finally, if you literally have none of the above, then consider playing a searching backup. That being said though, the odds of you being in this sort of situation is really low, and in my testing almost never happens. After you've gotten your Agrius out, the next priority is to play Renoa. If you have the ability to play her on your first turn, then play her straight away. You have a 60% chance of being able to play her on your first turn, if you're going first. If you hit a search backup with Agrius, you'll be able to play her on your first turn. If you had to search for Agrius with Whip, then wait on playing Renoa. You have 2 backups already, so playing Renoa on the following turn with your 2 backups is more efficient. So after your basic opening, you'll have 2 7k forwards and 2 to 3 backups. At this stage, prioritize putting more backups down. Use Setzer or Steiner to find your free CP searcher and use them to ramp up. You've gotten a board before your opponent, so they're under a lot of pressure to put a wall in front of your 7k attackers. If they take the advantage and prioritize backups, then get free damage with Renoa and Agrius and focus on backups. If they start discarding cards to play 4 CP AK forwards, then start using your cards like Genesis or your summons like Bismarck to get around them to keep the pressure on. You want to force your opponent to discard cards to try and slow the damage. If your opponent plays 7Ks to trade with your forwards, let them trade. By trading your Renoas or Agriuses into their 7Ks, you're getting advantage in most cases, and allows you to play more Renoas than Agriuses. If you do have the choice, it's better to trade Renoa instead of Agrius, as it's cheaper to replace her. If you haven't built up the free backups yet, then Celis is another great way to pull ahead on 2 backups. By freezing your opponent's backups, you can force your opponent to discard more cards from your hand in order to play cards. If your opponent is playing a slow game, you can do major disruption using discard effects in Glacier or Sephiroth once you have free backups. You should be pretty ahead at this stage of the game. It isn't hard for you to have built up to 5 backups pretty quickly. At this stage, you've also got at least 3 to 5 damage on your opponent. Use Orphan or other disruption cards like Glaciers to get through big blockers and push through for damage. And it's around now that I should mention that Agrius has a second ability. So when you have 7 or more cactus on the field, she gets plus 2k, making her a large 9k forward, 10k if you have Ophelia. All you need to do is get 5 backups and have another forward on the field. Also, if you have both Ico and Ophelia, 5 CP Steiner becomes an 8k that can search for a copy of himself when he enters play. 5 backups is when Legendary Sephiroth really starts hurting your opponent. You'll have to pay for his 7 CP by dulling 5 of your backups and discarding 1 card, but it forces your opponent to discard 2 cards from their hand. It's a really cost-effective way to start limiting your opponent's big plays without needing you to be at 0 cards. Not only that, but once your Sephiroth is on the field, he forces your opponent to deal with him. He either starts pressuring attacks with his passive ability to dull and freeze forwards, or forces even more discards really cheaply with his Shadow Flare ability, oftentimes doing both on the same turn. Finally, your go-to ender is Orphan. With 3 copies of him in hand and 2 different backups that can search for him, you'll definitely have at least 1 copy available to play in the endgame. While his effect does allow you to freeze and dull 2 forwards on entry if you have 5 or more ice characters, you don't always need to wait until you have 4 other ice characters to play him. If you have a decent sized board already, playing him to just dull 2 guys is often enough to push through lethal damage. So there's not much else to say about your endgame. Most of your cards are pretty high costed, so if you do ramp up to 5 backups, you're in a very good position to lock your opponent out from the game from there. Now onto some spicy combos for the deck. Obviously the main combo card of this deck is Renoa. While her main use will obviously be to copy Agrius' effect, she can also be used with literally any other forward you have on the field. So depending on what you need at the time, you can play her for a wide variety of effects. She gets significantly better when you have Devout on the field as well, as you can activate Devout in response to your opponent's effects and summons. If your opponent does something that would destroy one of your forwards, you can always break Devout to put Renoa into play, remove the forward they are trying to destroy, put it back into play and get the enter play ability again, allowing you to protect your forward, get a 7k forward on the field, and using that forward to enter play ability again. Talking about Devout, don't forget you can always use the bring back Celis at any time during your turn. So when your opponent tries to cast a big summon like Diabolos, Exodus, or Titan, you can always Devout your Celis onto the field and use her runic ability to cancel out the summon if you have a copy of her in your hand, which you'll often have during the mid game as you have 2 different ways of searching for her. Your summons are also really flexible as well, considering that 8 out of 10 summons are ones that have different modes to them. While Glacial Bolas will usually be used to discard and dull forwards, it can also be used to deal 7k to dull forwards, which in combination with Celis' ability can allow you to destroy larger forwards. Bismarck's main use will be to win combat, but it can also be used to return your forwards to your hand in response to certain removal effects like Diabolos, but especially towards the later game, it can be used to return forwards back to your hand to play them again for their enter play abilities. Picking up an Orphan, then playing it back down will usually open your opponent's board up enough for you to swing through. And that's pretty much it for the deck. Now onto the specific matchups. Probably the most common matchup you'll see in general is Wind Water, and probably one of the harder matchups to deal with. The key here is to set up and ramp up faster than your opponent. Your opponent will usually require at least a couple of turns to get some backups down before their value cards like Pain or Bard start coming down. By getting Agrius and Renoa down fast, you'll either put them on high damage early on, or force them to make a lot of unfavorable discards. Using either Sephiroth when you're on free backups and before your opponent has fully set up will also hinder them a lot. The big card to keep in mind at all times is Diabolos. A large majority of its discards are susceptible to it. That being said, this deck has a lot of answers to it. If you disrupt it, you will have gained a lot of advantage, as your opponent won't be able to reactivate all their backups with it. Having Bismarck in hand from the mid game onwards is a must for this matchup, but you've always got Celis' runic ability and Devouting Renoa as well to deal with Diabolos. Don't worry about Chaos Walker of the Wheel. Your opponent will be unbelievably stupid if they ever want to cast that on you. If they ever do feel lucky though, penalize the shit out of them with a free Sephiroth or Agrius. They might also try to use Valor Forward to trade their smaller forwards into your larger forwards, but don't forget that you always have Leviathan's third ability to prevent their summons from dealing damage. This deck does struggle with controlling a wide board, so we do have 2 copies of Zalera, which is great against decks that like to swarm. It hits all the good costs of swarm decks, 5, 2, and mostly free CP. Do know that Porom and Leviathan both have effects to negate action abilities, so if your opponent wants to use effects like Yuri and Alhanalem, you'll be able to stop them at key times. As for the next most popular deck, Wind Earth, their game plan is pretty similar, and our game plan to deal with it is also pretty much the same. Speed is still very much the essence. The longer the game goes, the more control the deck will set up. Ultimately, we want to stop them from getting 2 Cactuars and a Dataluma down onto the field. Wind Earth has a lot of search to get their pieces together pretty consistently, but it does take time for them to do it. As usual, keep your anti-summon tools to deal with Diabolos and try to get some good discard effects down early. Also, keep in mind that most of their backups will be action abilities, so using a well-timed Porom or Leviathan to stop a Star Sybil, or more importantly a Minor, will be very important. If your opponent has only 1 character on the field when they play Dataluma, you can also use Porom to stop it as well. If your opponent is playing with the variant with Legendary Zidane, then having Glacial Bolas will allow you to kill it off when it attacks. As for Dataluma, we don't have a great solution to it, just accept that you might have to run one of your larger forwards into it as a trade. But in situations where your opponent has taken quite a bit of damage, it's better just to disable it with a dull effect or bounce it with Leviathan and attack through. It's pretty much the only forward in the deck that we're actually afraid of. Now regarding Mono Wind, this is probably our hardest matchup. Pretty much it's exactly the same as the previous matchups, except it will be a lot harder to attack through to your opponent. Pretty much everything you do is hard countered by Wind. Freezing basically has no effect in this matchup. Freezing a backup does nothing against Vada. Freezing any guy in general is completely useless against Bards. Occasionally you'll dull one of their guys to attack through it and they'll hit a Bard's EX burst for sad times. Then, if your opponent is playing certain Wind tech cards, your life gets even more difficult. Ranger can't be chosen by your forwards, and White Mage completely counters your Devouts. Even their basic lineup of cards hurt you a lot. Archer hitting your only Ophelia or Juklag is rough, your Stola can't be dealt damage by Glacial Bolas, and Vada being a free AK is just the right size to wall you off during the mid game. The only line of play you have in this matchup is to ramp up faster than your opponent and to hit their hand as much as possible before they get to 5 backups. Their 2 big cards are effectively free, but only if they have 5 backups. Forcing your opponent to play Bards or Diabolos by discarding a card will really help you outvalue them. In the early game, just let your Renoa and Agrius trade off against their 7Ks and attack through with the rest of your guys. Putting down your Anthem backups will buff your guys just over your opponents, allowing you to attack through. As usual, keep your responses to their summons. Bismarck and Celos for Diabolos, and keep a legendary Sephiroth in hand to deal with Chaos Walker. Fortunately, Wind doesn't really run Oracle anymore, so you'll be relying a lot on Zalera to win your games. The ideal time to play this is when they play Bards. Often they will attack through with all their guys, then play Bards in the second main phase to reactivate their forwards. Dropping a Zalera in response while they have 5 backups dulled is the best chance that you have of wiping a couple of their guys away. To be honest, this is a really hard matchup, and if you lose this one, then don't feel too bad. Moving on to Ice. Now that Turbo Discard is no longer a thing, we don't have to worry about starting a game off with half our usual hand size. In this matchup, we pretty much go about our usual game plan. Ice forwards aren't typically known for their size, so having Anthem buffs in Juklag or Ophelia will allow us to run over their 4 CP AK forwards like Genesis and Renoa. It also gets most of our guys outside the 7k range of Glacial Bolas. And while our opponents can match our Juklag with their Juklag, we don't actually have to commit free CP when we want to play ours, so our opponent will usually be behind in speed if they do try to match it. Do remember that Renoa can remove and replay our forwards, so if our opponent spends resources freezing our guys, we can just play Renoa to effectively remove the freeze effect. During the mid game, it is super important to keep at least 2 of your summons in hand. Vayne is a pain to deal with. You'll need at least 2 damage sources in order to kill it, such as Celes, Bismarck and Glacius. Fortunately, he doesn't see too much play at the moment. Other than that, there's not much else to be said really. Just get your Anthem backups down and keep answers to deal with Vayne. The water matchup really comes down to luck. Does your opponent hit enough good EX bursts at the right times to stop you or not? If they are playing the Fusoya build, then you're in a good position. Our deck is able to put down a lot of damage very quickly early on, so your opponent won't get too many shots of Fusoya in. As for the summons that opponents will burst with, they don't seem to be that bad in the early game. Using Leviathan to put our Agrius or Renoa back to hand just doesn't feel that penalizing. Famfrit also feels the same. Just clear out the Renoa and play another copy of her for big value. Depending on how your opponent uses the Layla and Vikings will determine how easy this match is. We definitely want the opponent to just meat shield with the Layla and Vikings. We lose no value from it, and it just guarantees cards in their hands that we can Sephiroth. It's actually more annoying when they just take the damage and swing back with their weenies, and while Zalera can't be used, it just isn't great value. You just have to keep dropping bodies to stop their weenies from attacking through. If they are playing the non-Fusoya build that focuses on Leonards and Knights, then we just focus on ramping up and dropping even bigger bodies on the field. Our Agrius gets big enough to run over max power Knights once we hit 7 characters, as well as our big beaters in Sephiroth and Orphan. Holding onto the Zalera on key turns to break 2 or 3 of the forwards will be very important in this matchup. Now onto lightning. In theory they should be pretty fast as they have Sid Previa, which is functionally very similar to how we use Agrius, but we're able to play our Agrius more consistently than they will be able to play Sid. Obviously lightning has a ton of removal, but most of the value of our guys are on entry. Having them break isn't as bad. Our guys are also generally bigger than theirs, so they'll have to constantly be removing our guys to attack through. Do note that legendary Sephiroth's on attack ability chooses the opponent's forward regardless of whether they have any cards or not. It just dulls and freezes it if they don't have any cards. So against Allure, you can always just choose it with your effect to use up Allure's protection effect, allowing you to finish it off with Glass Yellow Ballers. The same thing can be also said about Celis when she deals damage to your opponent as well. While normally Edea is a very good card in Lightning, it's very rarely useful against this deck. Her effect isn't even relevant until your opponent has at least 4 backups on the field. As for the other boss forward in Lightning, Estinian, it should never really get to that stage of the game, but Zalira in response to his reactivation effect is pretty good. It's also pretty good value against most of the Lightning weenies as well. Talking about Zalira, if your opponent has a double Allure on the field, never just cast Zalira. Attack with one of your weaker forwards first to try and bait out Shoal. If you Zalira first, they'll be able to cancel out your Zalira's effect. But if you bait out the Shoal first, you've just claimed an extra Allure from your opponent's hand with your Zalira. As for that one other threat that Lightning has, Zemus, don't even worry about it. While the deck doesn't have any tools to directly remove it, the Lightning player almost never blocks with it. But what about his effect? Oh, you mean his action ability? Poor got that forward locked down. But, if you really want to style on your opponent, just hold a Leviathan in hand. Remember that time I threw a White Mage at my opponent? Well, you too can be a badass by throwing a Leviathan at your opponent when they try to use his ability. Let me know in the comment section below if any of you guys ever managed to Leviathan a Zemus after your opponent commits 6 CP to try to revive it in Edea. Regarding Mono Earth, not much to say here. Mono Earth is just too slow and honest to really hurt you that much. They don't use Gaia anymore, so your dull effects will usually open them up for attacks. Earth does have a pretty efficient tool to deal with your forwards in the form of Hecaton Care, but as long as you hold Bismarck as a response, you'll almost always come out ahead. Worst case scenario, you can always use Leviathan to return their forward back to their hand as a response as well. Against fire decks, you just gotta play your usual game plan. Not too much to be afraid of here. Just some cheap, efficient small bodies and a lot of removal. The main thing to note is using Leviathan to stop their summons from dealing damage to your forwards. This is especially true if they're cheeky and they're trying to play Krill in their deck. Make sure you cast Leviathan in response to your opponent's Phoenix if they ever try to target Krill for revival, so that neither spell ability effect is useful. Also, if you're in a game winning situation and want to lock up the chances of getting EX bursted, you can just cast Leviathan to protect your forwards before you start attacking. If your opponent is playing a more Swarmier Fire build, then play Zalira to deal with 2 or 3 of their guys at a time. It deals with Rain and the Waft monsters, Soul without Aegis, and Lednar without having to pay his cost. Other than that, it's just a straight up fight. Your guys and summons versus their guys and summons. Not too many gauge patrolling combos from fire that you need to look out for, and they can't really stop your effects, so it's all about making good trades and getting good value on your cards. And that's it guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Definitely give this deck a shot if you feel the game is starting to get a little bit stale at your local scene, and do let me know how this deck goes for you. I'm pretty recharged after the holidays and I'm ready to get back into it. I'll be back to streaming FFTCG online 2 days a week. Wednesdays and Fridays from 9 AM to 3 PM on my Twitch channel, Grand Jason. There's a link in the description below. Local time conversions are on screen now, so if you want to see me play awesome decks like this online, please tune in then. Otherwise, I'll catch you guys next week as I show you what I can do with a legendary Praetorian.